The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Danielle Ross moved through the Seattle General ICU with a kind of invisible efficiency that made her presence feel less like arrival and more like the room had always been that way. She didn't announce herself. She didn't make eye contact longer than necessary. She simply appeared at bedsides, checked monitors, adjusted for flows, and disappeared again, a ghost in scrubs, moving between lives with a precision that belonged to someone who had learned to navigate spaces where mistakes meant blood on tile floors and names on flags. Dr. Pierce watched her from the nurse's station, his eyes tracking her movements the way a hawk tracks a mouse that might be carrying something valuable. He was a tall man with the kind of wealth-coded appearance that screamed private schools and family money, tailored white coat, expensive watch, jawline that seemed carved from the same marble as the hospital's lobby columns. He didn't watch her because she was a good nurse. He watched her because she had become a problem, and problems in his experience could be managed if you identified them early enough. 8 months ago, Danielle had caught something. A small thing. An equipment order that didn't match the hospital's actual purchase, a cardiac monitor system billed to Seattle General for $32,000, but the device itself had been diverted to a medical supply company called Meridian Health Systems. Dr. Pierce owned a shell corporation that owned 3/4 of Meridian Health Systems. The profits from those diverted orders ran approximately $7,000 per month directly into accounts he controlled, and he had been very careful about the bookkeeping, very careful about the documentation, very careful about everything except for the moment when he hadn't noticed a nurse with military-grade attention to detail reading the equipment manifest over his shoulder. Danielle hadn't reported it. That was what troubled him most. She had simply noted it with the kind of calm acknowledgement of an anomaly that suggested she was still deciding what to do with the information. In his experience, silence was more dangerous than accusation because silence meant the decision hadn't been made yet. Silence meant she was still gathering data. She pushed the medication cart past his office at 0630 hours, her movements fluid and precise, shoulders back in a way that suggested posture training rather than nursing school training. Her badge hung at her hip, grey ID photo showing a woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to be looking through the camera rather than at it. Her name tag read simply, D. Ross, RN. No credentials. No initials that might suggest previous experience. Just D. Ross, and something about that minimalism bothered him the way a piece of a puzzle bothers you when you can't remember what the picture is supposed to be. The morning shift at Seattle General moved with a rhythm of controlled chaos, phones ringing, monitors beeping their constant low-level alerts, the ventilators wheezing their mechanical breath. The antiseptic smell of the ICU was thick enough to taste, that particular combination of bleach and human suffering that never quite left your sinuses after 8 hours. Danielle worked through it all without complaint, without the social chatter that marked most nurses as fundamentally human rather than fundamentally competent. She simply worked. Roommate held a patient who had arrived 3 days ago with no identification, no insurance card, no wallet, no keys. The ambulance had picked him up off Commerce Street near the warehouse district, unresponsive, with severe thermal burns across 40% of his body and a basilar skull fracture that should have killed him on impact. What kept him alive was muscle memory that ran deeper than consciousness, a man whose body knew how to fight, whose breathing pattern suggested military training even in coma, whose right hand remained clenched around a set of dog tags even as the trauma team worked to stabilize him. Danielle had read the tags the morning they admitted him. SGT Marcus Vance. Ranger tab visible in the photo on his shoulder flash. The folded flag in his pack bore the name of someone else, someone from Helmand Province, someone from the part of her life that the Pentagon had decided never existed. She had tucked the flag carefully under his pillow where the machines couldn't disturb it, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, the way you moved when you were standing on the edge of a cliff and had learned not to look down. Marcus Vance. The name opened a door she had sealed shut for years ago when she was extracted from a black site operation in Helmand Province with a classified debrief and an offer of medical discharge to a civilian contractor identity. Captain Danielle Ross, call sign Reaper, had become D. Ross, RN, a woman who checked vitals and avoided eye contact and took her lunch breaks alone in the employee parking garage where no one could see her hands shake if they decided to shake, which they hadn't because shaking was a luxury for people whose hands weren't responsible for surgical decisions made under fire. Vance was the medic who had taken her rotation with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Vance was 23 years old when she last saw him in the FOB Shank Infirmary. Vance was supposed to be on leave in Fort Benning, supposed to be anywhere except a comatose body in Denver with thermal burns and a head wound and his hand still gripping dog tags like they were the only real thing left in the world. The resident was making rounds when Danielle arrived at roommate to check his antibiotic drip. Dr. Harrison, young, competent, fundamentally afraid of his own shadow, was reviewing Vance's chart with the kind of distracted attention that meant he hadn't actually looked at the numbers in approximately 20 minutes. The full line was running, the monitors were steady, the numbers across the screens told a story of a man whose body was fighting, whose sepsis markers were climbing by approximately 2 percentage points per day, whose fever spiked every evening at 1900 hours with the kind of regularity that suggested infection rather than inflammation. The vancomycin is written for 2 grams every 8 hours, Danielle said, her voice neutral in that particular way that made it clear she wasn't suggesting anything. She was simply stating what the chart said. His renal function indicates his running at 78%. 2 grams is trending toward accumulation. Dr. Harrison looked at the chart. He looked at the vitals. He looked at Danielle in a way that suggested he was trying to remember if she had the authority to speak at all. The infection is progressing, he said finally. We need to be aggressive. I need some coffee, Danielle said, stepping back from the bedside with a kind of smooth retreat that suggested she had never tried to challenge anything at all. Just a nurse. Just someone making an observation. Just someone moving through the ICU like she belonged there, which she did, but not in the way anyone thought she belonged. She was walking past Dr. Pierce's office when he called her in, his voice carrying the kind of tone that made it clear he wasn't making a request. The office smelled like expensive cologne and the ghost of something darker, ambition, maybe, or the particular smell that money develops when it comes from places it shouldn't. He sat behind his desk with the kind of posture that suggested he had never doubted himself in his life, and Danielle stood in the doorway with her hands loose at her sides in a way that looked casual to anyone who wasn't trained to read bodies. I've noticed you reviewing equipment orders, he said. That's outside your scope. I was verifying inventory, Danielle said. For our unit count. Inventory is handled by procurement. His eyes had gone flat in a way that suggested this conversation had already been decided in his mind approximately 8 months ago. I'm going to need you to focus on patient care, Ms. Ross. We can't have nurses overstepping into administrative functions. It creates problems. The way he said problems suggested he was already thinking about problems, already planning for them, already calculating the trajectory of whatever was about to happen next. Danielle nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged nothing except her understanding of the words he had used. Of course, Doctor, she said, and turned to leave. That evening, a file appeared on his computer labeled Performance Review, Danielle Ross. It contained 3 documented medication errors that had never happened, 2 patient complaints that didn't exist, and a note that read, Pattern of insubordination and scope creep. Recommend close monitoring for future action. He saved it to his encrypted folder where he kept other files, financial records, Shell Corporation documentation, photographs of purchasing orders that didn't match actual deliveries. Insurance, he thought. Everything was insurance. And this particular insurance policy was starting to look like it might need to be activated sooner rather than later. Danielle clocked out at 18:30 hours and walked through the Denver evening toward the parking garage where her car sat in the same space it occupied every day, a corner spot, easy exit, minimal witnesses. Her hands were steady as she gripped the steering wheel. Her breathing was controlled. But in the ICU in Room 8, a man with ranger tattoos and dog tags continued to fight a fever that was climbing toward territory where even military-grade endurance would stop mattering very much. Room for 12 had a view of the parking lot and a family that wouldn't stop asking questions. Danielle had prepared the insulin dose exactly as written on the physician's order, 5 units of Humalog subcutaneously at 14:25 hours, her hand steady as the needle drew up the clear liquid, her breathing controlled and mechanical. The patient, a 73-year-old man with diabetes and a fresh hip replacement, lay propped at 45 degrees. His wife sat in the corner chair. Their two adult children stood by the window. Danielle swabbed the injection site with antiseptic that smelled like every hospital in America, and she was pinching the skin when Dr. Pierce pushed through the door without knocking. He saw the syringe. His face changed. "That's the wrong dose," he said. Loud. The kind of loud that made the wife flinch and the children turn from the window like he'd fired a shot. Danielle didn't flinch. She held the position, skin pinched, syringe steady, face stone. "This is your order, doctor. 5 units at 1425. "I never wrote 5 units. His voice climbed. "This is exactly the kind of incompetence I've come to expect from someone with your credentials. You're a danger to this hospital. A danger to every patient on this floor." He stepped toward her, his eyes hot, his presence like a shark catching blood in the water. Nurse fumble strikes again. The wife made a small sound. One of the children, the daughter, turned away. Danielle set the syringe down on the sterile field. She turned. She picked up the physician's order from the bedside table. The handwriting was unmistakable. His handwriting. She held it toward him, and when he snatched it, she kept her hands at her sides, absolutely steady, the trembling that wanted to happen pinned down so deep it couldn't reach her muscles. Her jaw tightened. Just that. Just the muscle of her jaw contracting once, twice, so small that only someone trained to read people, someone who'd spent 8 years learning to hide everything, would have caught it. He scanned the order. For 2 seconds, he said nothing. Then, "Your job is to follow orders, not question them. If you can't handle that, find another profession." He threw the paper onto the bed and walked out, his shoe striking the tile with the sound of a judge's gavel. Danielle picked up the syringe. She administered the correct dose into the subcutaneous space with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could throw at her. The patient watched her. His wife watched her. His children watched her. Nobody spoke. She disposed of the needle in the sharps container with its small metallic clink and documented the administration in the electronic medical record, 5 units Humalog, 1427 hours, for site assessment normal, patient tolerating well. She turned to the family and said, "He's going to be fine. Blood sugar should stabilize within the hour. Please let me know if he needs anything." The wife nodded. She didn't look relieved. She looked like she'd just watched her daughter's teacher scream at her daughter and knew it was wrong, and wasn't sure what to do about that. Danielle left the room at 1431. The break room was on the 3rd floor, 40 meters down a corridor that smelled like floor wax and the chemical underneath everything in a hospital, that clean smell that was really just the smell of disinfectant covering something else. She made it there without passing anyone, carrying her lunch in a container her daughter Emma had decorated with hand-drawn hearts and stick-figure nurses. She opened the refrigerator and set it on the middle shelf, the same shelf where she'd left it yesterday and the day before. She sat at the Formica table by the window overlooking the parking lot. The afternoon sun cut through at a harsh angle. Nurse Chen was in the middle of a conversation with Rodriguez about staffing ratios. Mid-sentence, mid-word almost, she looked up, saw Danielle, and suddenly remembered something urgent about charts. She gathered her phone and left. Rodriguez checked his cell phone, he hadn't been holding it 10 seconds earlier, and said he had to make a call. The room emptied around her like water draining from a sink. She ate her sandwich alone. Turkey, Swiss cheese, mustard on wheat bread that Emma had picked out at the grocery store last Tuesday. She chewed mechanically. Each bite took the same number of chews. 14. She'd counted once out of boredom and the number had stuck. The sandwich was 3 bites. 42 chews. 2 minutes and 17 seconds. She finished at 15:18. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. She could hear the refrigerator compressor humming in the corner, could hear the distant sound of a code being called over the intercom in a unit she didn't work, could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, resting at a steady 68 beats per minute because she had trained for years to keep her heart rate down when things felt heavy. 8 years of that training, moving through the world like a ghost, speaking when spoken to, keeping her head down, keeping her hands empty, keeping the captain locked so far away inside that even she sometimes forgot what her voice sounded like when she gave orders. She threw away her container. She drank water from the tap without letting her hands shake. The break room fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. By 15:35, she was back on the unit, reviewing medication administration for room 407, a post-op knee reconstruction, and her charge nurse looked at her with the kind of sympathy that meant she'd heard. Of course she'd heard. This was a hospital. Bad news traveled through hospitals faster than sepsis through a blood culture. Shift change approached like weather moving in. The day shift wrapped up their notes, printed their handoff reports, handed responsibility over to the evening team. At 18:36, as Danielle was completing her final medication reconciliation for room 413, she noticed something on the unit board. A formal write-up, printed, dated 14:32 hours, with the incident timestamp and room number and the words insubordination and failure to follow physician orders per documented physician assessment. Dr. Pierce's signature was at the bottom. It was CC'd to the Chief of Nursing, to HR, to the hospital administrator, to someone in the legal department. She read it once. Then once more. She didn't memorize it. She'd never needed to memorize anything in her life, because memory was what happened when you couldn't let things go, and she'd mastered the art of letting things go. This would become part of her personnel file. This was the first documented strike. This was the beginning of building a case. This was how you removed someone from an organization when you didn't have a legitimate reason. You fabricated one, slowly, methodically, one write-up at a time, until the weight of documentation crushed the person underneath it. She signed the acknowledgement box at the bottom of the form. The pen didn't tremble in her hand. Her signature was the same as it always was, neat, controlled, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to make themselves disappear in plain sight. At 7 p.m. hours exactly, she clocked out. She turned in her badge to the security desk. She walked to her car in the parking lot where the sun was dropping below the buildings and the evening was cooling down and the smell of diesel exhaust drifted from the street. She sat in the driver's seat of her Honda Civic, a 2015, practical, unremarkable, invisible, and she started the engine. The radio came on. Some country song about being stronger than yesterday. She turned it off. She drove home to pick up Emma from aftercare, to make dinner, to help with homework, to read books with names like The Very Hungry Caterpillar and Charlotte's Web, to tuck her 8-year-old daughter into bed and hear that small voice say, "Mommy, you're sad today," and to swallow everything and lie and say, "No, baby, I'm just tired," because that was what mothers did. That was what soldiers did. That was what people who'd seen their brothers die and carried their flags and learned to function in the spaces between heartbeats did. They protected the people around them from the weight of their own survival. But what Danielle didn't know, as she drove through Denver in the gathering dark, was that somewhere in the Seattle General ICU, in room 8, the one with the Army Ranger in the coma and the dog tags clutched in a burned hand, Sergeant Vance's fever was climbing. His oxygen saturation was drifting down. And the night resident, the one Dr. Pierce had told to reduce monitoring frequency, to allocate resources elsewhere, was in another room, unaware that the patient who'd fought through Sanjin Valley and the worst combat trauma imaginable was starting to fight for something as simple as his next breath. And then the alert came. Code Blue, Room 8. Code Blue, Room 8. The intercom wailed at 23:19, and everything that had been preparing itself in the darkness finally had permission to begin. The code alarm screamed at 0200 hours like something wounded, and Danielle's body moved before her conscious mind caught up. She was still in street clothes, jeans, a grey hoodie, her badge clipped to the zipper, having stayed past shift change to finish charting. The stairwell would take 30 seconds. The elevator took 60. She hit the stairs 3 at a time, her legs remembering the muscle memory of running toward the sound of incoming fire instead of away from it. Room 8 was chaos dressed as protocol. The on-call resident, Patterson, second year, shaking hands that belonged in a pediatrics rotation, not a trauma bay, stood frozen in front of the monitor showing oxygen saturation plummeting. 87. 79. 62. The numbers dropped like a body falling through water. Sergeant Marcus Vance's neck was distended, his burned chest heaving against the ventilator like something was strangling him from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. The second lung collapsing. 40 seconds before brain damage. 30 seconds before cardiac arrest. The room smelled of antiseptic and fear, that particular copper wire stench that came off panic. "Someone get needle decompression kit," Patterson said, his voice thin as thread, not a command but a question disguised as instruction. He looked at the assembled code team as if expecting someone else to move first. No one did. Nurses waited for orders. Orders never came. The heart monitor's rhythm deteriorated into something irregular, something that looked like the screen was shaking itself apart. Danielle stood in the doorway for exactly one breath. She saw Vance's burned face, third-degree charring across the left side, consistent with explosion trauma. She saw the dog tag still clutched in his bandaged right hand, the chain visible through the gauze. SGT Marcus Vance. The medic. The one who'd taken her slot with the 75th Ranger Regiment after Operation Copper Valley, after the Pentagon had erased Captain Danielle Ross from every system that mattered. The one who'd carried a folded flag in his pack through Helmand Province, a flag she knew belonged to SSGT Rodriguez, who'd stepped on an IED in San Juan Valley while she was supposed to have been there. The monitor flat-lined. A single sustained note, urgent and absolute. She moved. The crash cart lived 3 meters from roommate's entrance. Danielle's hands pulled open the top drawer, red-tagged equipment, surgical instruments, scalpels arranged like teeth. Her fingers found the handle without looking. Muscle memory didn't recognize civilian time zones. Muscle memory only knew that you ran toward the dying and you ran fast. Patterson's eyes widened as she pushed past him. You can't just. She was already moving to Vance's left side, the burned side, the side that was killing him. Ribs. They were under the charred tissue, waiting, the second and third intercostal spaces a geography she could navigate blind. The scalpel went in with the same certainty it had in a dusty compound outside Helmand Province, under the roar of Black Hawk rotors and the rattle of incoming fire, her hand steady as a surgical laser while the world came apart around her. The blade moved through burned skin like cutting through paper. Blood well dark and arterial. No hesitation. No tremor. The hands that had held lives together in desert combat held them together now, in this climate-controlled room where the only explosive force was the collapsing lung pushing everything toward the center. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something else entirely. Something the room recognized as authority. The nurse beside her moved without question, muscle memory of her own. Danielle's left hand held the incision open while her right hand positioned the needle, feeling for the exact space, the exact angle. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was the same whether it was written in textbooks or written in burning memory, and 1,000 nights when she couldn't sleep because she kept hearing Rodriguez breathing, then not breathing. The needle punched through the pleural membrane and the hiss of air escaping filled the room like a sigh of relief from a body that had been holding its breath. Pressure released. The sound was pure oxygen leaving, the lung re-expanding, physics and desperation and training all aligned for one perfect moment. The monitor responded instantly. The flatline became a rhythm. 84. 91. 103. The numbers climbed like a ladder being thrown down into a drowning man's hands. Vance's oxygen saturation stopped its descent. Stopped at 78. Climbed to 85. 90. The ventilator's rhythm synchronized with something that looked almost like a human breath. Blood pressure stabilizing, the nurse said, and her voice carried the shock of someone watching the impossible happen in front of them. 102/68 and climbing. Danielle stepped back. Her scrubs, the borrowed ones she'd pulled on because hers were still in the locker, were stained dark. The scalpel hung in her right hand, loose, familiar as an extension of her arm. She was breathing steady. Pulse steady. The part of her brain that had learned to decompress that was the only part awake now, the part that existed in a different timeline than this one. The doors to room 8 burst open. Dr. Pierce stood in the frame for exactly 1 second. His eyes moved from the monitor, now showing something approaching normal sinus rhythm, to Vance's now stabilized chest, to the open incision, to the scalpel in Danielle's hand, to her face. In that second, everything recalibrated. His jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with something that looked like hunger, like relief, like a man who'd been waiting for his ammunition to arrive. "What in the name of God are you doing?" His voice was sharp, edged with something that cut deeper than the scalpel ever could. He was moving toward her already, his hands raised, taking command like a man who'd been waiting all his life for someone to hand him exactly this moment. That is practicing medicine without a license. That is gross violation of scope of practice. That is his pneumothorax, Danielle said. Her voice was quiet. Clinical. A nurse reporting facts to a physician. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Pressure relieved. Oxygen levels normalizing. He was in cardiac arrest, and Dr. Patterson was unable to. "I don't care what Patterson was unable to do," Dr. Pierce said, and his voice was getting louder, more official, every word a nail being driven into a coffin that already had her name on it. "I care that you just performed a surgical procedure as a nurse. I care that you compromised this patient's care. I care that you made a decision that was not yours to make." The room had gone silent. That particular silence that comes when everyone in a space realizes they're watching a murder happen, only the weapon is bureaucracy and the death is slower but just as inevitable. Patterson was staring at the floor. The other nurses were suddenly very interested in their monitors. Vance's oxygen saturation held steady at 93%, his heart beating in perfect sinus rhythm, his brain getting exactly the oxygen it needed to survive the next day, the next week, the next year. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce was already pulling out his phone with his left hand, already dialing, already speaking into the speakerphone before anyone could stop him, his voice carrying across the room with the weight of someone who'd learned a long time ago that volume was sometimes louder than authority. "Security," he said. "This is Dr. Pierce in the ICU. I need an incident report filed immediately." I witnessed a nurse. He turned his back to Danielle, his voice dripping with something that tasted like satisfaction, performing unauthorized medical procedures on a patient. Practicing medicine without a license. I want documentation of this breach before end of shift. This is a patient safety violation of the highest order. Danielle stood motionless in the corner of room 8. The scalpel was still in her right hand. She looked down at it as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Vance was breathing steadily now, his burned chest rising and falling with the ventilator's rhythm, alive because of the person holding the scalpel, dying professionally because of the person holding the phone. She set the scalpel on the sterile field with the precision of someone placing a weapon back in an armory. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 23 years of military training telling her that the worst thing you could do in that moment was speak, react, defend, or argue. So she did none of those things. She simply stood there, watching Dr. Pierce pace the room like a man who'd finally caught the shadow he'd been chasing, and waited for the next thing to begin. Dr. Pierce stood in the trauma bay doorway, his phone already raised, already recording. His hand shook, not from shock, but from rage so pure it felt like electricity in his veins. She was still bent over Vance's open chest cavity, her gloved fingers precise inside the thoracic space, her voice steady as a surgeon's laser. Pressures equalizing. Lungs re-expanding. "Get me a chest tube tray." Not a question. Not a request. An order. The nurses moved without hesitation, and that was what finally broke something in Dr. Pierce's composure. They were listening to her, not to him. He jabbed at his phone screen. "Security. Now. Trauma Bay 4. Medical emergency." His voice cracked on the second sentence. By the time Danielle had sutured the initial incision and stepped back from the table, vitals climbing steadily back into the land of the living, Dr. Pierce had already typed the first incident report, his fingers hammering the keyboard like he was trying to punch through the screen. Practicing medicine without a license. Gross violation of scope of practice. Endangerment of patient. Each phrase a nail in a coffin he was building with his own hands, unaware that he was sealing himself inside it. The morning came grey and cold, rain hammering the parking lot like applause for something Danielle would never get to celebrate. She'd showered. Changed. Put on the clothes she'd worn 2 days ago, yesterday's jeans, a tank top under a wool coat that smelled like detergent and time. Her badge hung around her neck, still active, still weighted, the laminate reflecting fluorescent light as she walked through the corridor toward HR at dawn. Nobody stopped her. Nobody made eye contact. The word had traveled faster than any official memo could move. She was finished. Mr. Patterson from Risk Management slid the termination letter across the desk at 6:38 a.m. 12 pages. She didn't need to read past the first paragraph. 3 separate violations, each meticulously documented, each cross-referenced with hospital bylaws like someone had been building this house brick by brick, waiting for the right moment to light the fuse. The fabricated medication discrepancies from 6 months ago. The insubordination charge from yesterday. And now, the new foundation stone, incident room 8, 0:14 hours, unauthorized medical intervention by nursing staff resulting in invasive surgical procedure without physician authorization, violation of Colorado Nursing Practice Regulations Section 12-38-106, grounds for immediate termination and referral to State Board. It was written with the precision of someone who'd been planning this not in hours but in months, someone whose patience had finally paid dividends. "You understand the severity," Patterson said. "Not a question." His voice moved like oil across water. "I do," Danielle replied. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She signed the form in the space marked with her initials, 17 separate acknowledgments of misconduct she hadn't committed, each one a small death. The pen moved smoothly. Her hands didn't shake. They never did, even when everything inside her was coming apart like a ship losing its hull in dark water. Security walked her to the parking lot at 7:15 a.m. 2 officers, professional and gentle, which somehow made it worse. They deactivated her badge at the gate. She heard the electronic beep, a small sound that erased 8 years of work in a single keystroke. The morning rain soaked through her coat. She didn't hurry. She walked at her normal pace, the same measured stride that had carried her through the ICU for nearly a decade, and got into her car without looking back at the building that had been her identity since the Pentagon had erased the other one. The drive home took 40 minutes. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't call anyone. She just drove through Denver with her hands at 10 and 2, her eyes on the road, her mind somewhere very far away, a valley in Helmand Province where the sun burned like a weapon and men bled into dust and there was no such thing as a second chance, only second deaths. The kitchen was too bright when she walked in. Emma was at school still, wouldn't be home for another 4 hours. Danielle sat at the kitchen table in the clothes she'd worn since dawn, still damp from the rain, and made coffee she didn't drink. The termination letter lay face down on the table beside her purse, its weight pressing down like gravity had doubled. She stared at the refrigerator, at the photos magnetized there, Emma's second-grade picture, a drawing of a house with too many windows, a postcard from her sister in Tucson that had arrived 3 years ago and never been taken down. The coffee went cold in the cup. The rain kept falling outside, steady and patient, like it had all the time in the world and was willing to spend it beating against glass. Danielle's hands finally released their grip on professionalism somewhere around noon. Her shoulders curled inward. Her breathing changed. The tears came silently, without sound, without the dignity of dramatic release, just a quiet dissolution of everything she'd held together for so long it had become muscle memory. That was how Emma found her at 3:48 p.m., when the school bus had dropped her off and she'd walked into the kitchen expecting her mother to be asleep or working, preparing for another night shift. Instead, her mother was still in yesterday's clothes, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a face that looked like it had been shattered and glued back together by someone who'd never seen a face before. "Mommy." Emma's voice was small, smaller than it should have been for a third grader who'd already learned that the world didn't always make sense. "Why are you home?" Danielle's hands moved automatically to her daughter's shoulders. She pulled Emma close without answering, because the truth, that she'd broken the first rule of survival, which was to never draw attention, to never shine brighter than the darkness around you, to never let anyone see what you were really capable of, was not something an 8-year-old needed to carry. She'd already given Emma enough weight to bear. "I made a mistake, baby," Danielle said quietly into her daughter's hair. It was the only truth she could offer. Emma didn't ask what kind. Emma just climbed into her lap and held on, the way children do when they understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone you love is simply be present in their darkness without trying to fix it. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, Danielle held her daughter and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The termination letter sat on the table beside them, 12 pages of proof that Captain Danielle Ross had been erased twice now, once by the Pentagon, and now by the man who'd spent 3 months building a house of cards that had toppled the moment she'd saved a life instead of protecting her own survival. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't fight back. Couldn't appeal the decision. Couldn't tell them the truth about who she was or why she'd known exactly how to perform that thoracotomy without hesitation or error. Because revealing the truth would mean admitting that Captain Ross still existed, that the Pentagon's carefully constructed fiction had failed, that the woman they'd spent so much effort erasing was standing in their hospital saving rangers whose names she wasn't supposed to remember and whose faces she couldn't forget. So she held her daughter and waited for the next thing to begin, because in her experience, there was always a next thing. There was always someone coming. You just never knew if they were coming to save you or to finish the job. 1 week later, Danielle sat at her kitchen table with 3 job applications spread across the laminate surface, each one asking the same impossible questions. Previous employer? Reason for termination? References from your last position? She couldn't write the truth. She couldn't write anything that wouldn't collapse under the background check that was about to begin. Her phone rang at 7:43 in the evening. Washington, D.C. area code. She stared at the number like it was a loaded weapon. Captain Ross. The voice was clipped, military, filtered through secure communications. "This is General Michael Halloway, JSOC Command. Stand by for verification." She didn't ask how they got her number. She didn't ask how they found her. The Pentagon had erased her once before. Finding her again would be trivial. "You're being recalled to active status effective immediately." Sergeant Marcus Vance regained consciousness at 1700 hours. "He identified you to our liaison officer as Reaper. The operation in Helmand Province is being declassified. You need to understand what that means." Danielle's hands trembled for the first time in 4 years. Not from fear. From the weight of being visible again. "What about my daughter?" Full dependent benefits reinstated as of 0800 this morning. Emma's school tuition, medical, the whole package. You saved a ranger's life using combat medicine in a civilian hospital. That's not something we bury anymore, Captain. Not after what happened in that ICU. Across Denver, at Seattle General, the conference room on the 4th floor had filled with uniforms an hour earlier. A Marine colonel stood before Sergeant Marcus Vance's hospital bed, reading from a citation in a voice like gravel under tires, for exceptional valor under fire in Helmand Province, September 2019. For actions that saved the lives of 12 personnel in direct contact with hostile forces. Sergeant Vance, awake for the first time in 8 days, with the purple bruising around his chest still purple as fresh plums, whispered across the silence, "That was Reaper. That was her." The colonel paused. Then a 2-star general entered the room. The general moved to the empty doorway, the threshold where no patient stood, and executed a perfect salute. The kind of salute reserved for the dead and the legendary. He turned to Vance, jaw set like reinforced concrete. Captain Danielle Ross operated under National Security Directive for 7-7. Codename Lazarus Protocol. She was invisible because she had to be invisible. The operation was never supposed to happen. But it happened anyway. And Sergeant, you're alive because she's the kind of warrior the Pentagon doesn't acknowledge until the fight's already over. Dr. Pierce had excused himself from the conference room moments before, claiming a patient emergency, but what he actually did was move toward his office with the careful speed of a man who understood he was drowning. He logged into the hospital security system at 16:47 and immediately began accessing the surgical suite footage from the night of the thoracotomy. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the clumsy desperation of someone who'd never learned how to actually delete anything. He pulled up the file. Then he pulled up the deletion protocol. What Dr. Pierce did not know was that Rodriguez, the hospital's IT specialist, a Navy veteran with 8 years of cryptographic training, had been monitoring the hospital's suspicious data access patterns since the second day Danielle worked there. Rodriguez had watched Dr. Pierce's login patterns. Watched him access equipment purchase orders that didn't match hospital requisitions. Watched him pull up patient charts at 3 in the morning when he wasn't on shift. Rodriguez had installed monitoring software on every administrative terminal, the kind that captured screenshots every 8 seconds. As Dr. Pierce clicked through the surgical footage, Rodriguez's system was taking pictures. As Pierce selected the deletion option, Rodriguez's software captured the keystroke. As Pierce attempted to empty the trash file, Rodriguez's capture logged the timestamp. 47 minutes of attempted deletion. Screenshot after screenshot of evidence that Dr. Pierce understood exactly how incriminating the footage was. But deleting footage wasn't enough. Dr. Pierce opened Sergeant Vance's medical chart and began editing the ventilator reduction orders, backdating them to appear as Dr. Pierce's own medical decision made on the morning of the thoracotomy. To appear competent. To appear justified. To appear like he'd been managing the case properly all along. Rodriguez's software screenshot every falsified entry. 23 alterations across the chart. Each one time-stamped. Each one proving that Dr. Pierce understood he'd lost. Then Dr. Pierce did the thing that finished him. He picked up his phone and called his contact at MedSupply Solutions, the shell company that had been funneling kickback payments to his personal account for 3 years. $340,000 in unmarked transfers disguised as consulting fees. He told them to pause the payments. He told them to prepare for a possible investigation. He didn't know that his call was being routed through a hospital line that the Pentagon's liaison officer was actively monitoring. At 17:20 hours, Rodriguez walked into Administrator Klein's office and placed a USB drive on the mahogany desk. The drive was small enough to fit in a palm. The contents were large enough to end careers. Everything, Rodriguez said quietly. Deletion attempts. Chart falsifications. A phone call to MedSupply Solutions. Also the spreadsheets showing the kickback scheme. 3 years' worth. The amount is $340,000. Klein was a woman who'd run hospital administration for 22 years without flinching. She flinched. She opened the drive. She watched the first video. 15 minutes later, she picked up the phone and called both the Washington State Medical Board and the Denver Police Department. She called hospital legal. She called security. At 17:58 hours, Dr. Pierce was summoned to Klein's office. He walked through the door expecting a meeting about scheduling. Instead, he found Seattle PD, the medical board investigator, and hospital security waiting in a lineup that looked like the end of a career. Dr. Pierce, Klein said, her voice the color of steel, we need to discuss your access to the surgical suite footage from September 16th. His face went white. The kind of white that comes when a man realizes his entire strategy has been discovered. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That was when the detective stepped forward with the arrest warrant. That was when Dr. Pierce understood that invisible people were very good at seeing things that didn't want to be seen. 6 months later, Danielle stood in her reinstated office. The nameplate on the door read Captain Danielle Ross, Clinical Director. The walls displayed her silver star in a frame beside a photograph of Emma wearing the Ranger beret that Holloway had given her during the declassification ceremony. Sergeant Vance's dog tags hung in Danielle's locker next to the folded flag, the one he'd carried all the way from Helmand Province, the one he'd insisted she keep because, he said, you earned this more than I did. Through the window of her office, Danielle could see the parking lot across the street. A medical supply van was parked there, backed up to the loading dock of a private prison healthcare facility. A man in civilian clothes, no longer in the white coat that meant authority, no longer bearing the title that had given him power, loaded boxes of syringes and 4 bags into the cargo hold. Dr. Pierce's physician's license had been revoked after a board hearing that lasted 11 minutes. The criminal charges were still proceeding. The kickback scheme had cost him everything that mattered. Danielle didn't watch him work. She'd moved past the moment when his punishment needed her attention. Instead, she reviewed tomorrow's ICU assignments, checking which nurses were scheduled for which patients, making sure the right people were in the right rooms. Making sure no patient would be vulnerable to someone who didn't see them. Emma arrived at the office at 16:30, still wearing her school uniform, still carrying her backpack like she'd conquered the world before 3 o'clock. She spotted the general's star gleaming in its frame and moved toward it with the focused intensity of a child who knew that things mattered. "Mommy, are you a hero?" Danielle knelt until they were eye to eye. She straightened Emma's collar, a habit from the army, from rooms where uniforms had to be perfect because perfection was discipline and discipline was respect. She glanced at the dog tags hanging in her open locker. The folded flag below them, pressed so carefully that every crease was razor-sharp. "I'm just a nurse, baby." "But the flag and the medals." "Those are reminders," Danielle said, her voice dropping into the register she used now, the voice that came from the place inside her that had held lives together in a valley she couldn't name on a mission that never officially happened. The bravest warriors aren't always the ones carrying guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they know that the real fight isn't about being seen. It's about being there when someone needs you most. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway with incident reports that needed her signature as clinical director. He caught his eye and gave the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passed between people who understood what it meant to carry secrets and then finally put them down. Through the window, Dr. Pierce drove the medical supply van away from the loading dock, away from the facility, away from Denver. Danielle didn't watch him go. She was already pulling up the chart for tomorrow's admission, a ranger with a gunshot wound to the abdomen who'd been transferred from a combat hospital in Germany. A case that would demand everything she knew. A case where being invisible was no longer possible, and being visible was finally a gift instead of a burden. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was relaxed. The trembling had stopped the moment General Holloway said her name again. Captain Danielle Ross was visible. And the world was about to learn what that meant. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, I want to hear from you. Subscribe for more stories of hidden warriors and the moments when the truth finally breaks the surface. Comment below, what would you have done if the Pentagon called your workplace? Like this video, and we'll see you next time.